Good morning. My name's Paul. I think I know most of you. If not, it's good to have you here. We are continuing in a study in Luke. And give me 1 second to get all of my items set up and ready. Want to just kind of catch us up. Last week we had Service Sunday. Thank you for those who came and served in the community and did projects and worked in places. That is super helpful. I'm going to back up from that guy just a little bit. 2 weeks ago, we had the opportunity to hear from Anthony Goddard, who's a missionary that has been living in a remote section of Brazil. If you weren't here to hear him talk about their experience, it is pretty moving and powerful to go along with what Brooklyn was just sharing about people that have no context of the gospel or of God or living in a first world country. It was pretty incredible. And then 3 weeks ago, Phil shared from Luke chapter 22, and today we're going to be in Luke chapter 23, and next week is the last chapter of Luke, Luke 24. So I want to back up. Since we've not talked about Luke for 2 weeks, we took 2 weeks off. We're going to come back. I want to just kind of catch us up to where we started and where we are and where we're going to be. All right? Does anybody remember who wrote the book of Luke? John did not. Luke wrote the book of Luke. Does anybody know why he wrote the book of Luke? Luke chapter 1, Luke tells us why he wrote it. Does anybody remember why Luke wrote the book of Luke? He said he endeavored to write a sequence of events. So Luke wanted to write a first-person narrative of what happened in the life of Jesus. Does anybody know what happens in Luke chapter 2? We generally read that chapter once a year at a pretty important time for kids who like to open gifts. What happens in Luke chapter 2? Jesus is born. My dad was a pastor for most of my life. Actually, all of my life. He was in Bible college when I was born. He was a pastor for all of my life. And he would tell the story that when his older kids, my older siblings, were little, he decided one Christmas to read the Christmas story. He spent an hour looking for it and couldn't find it. Didn't know where it was in the Bible. But then later on in his life, he knew a whole lot about it and preached about it. So Luke chapter 2, we find Jesus is born. Luke chapter 23 is the end of Jesus' earthly life. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the events leading up to and Jesus' death. And then next week, Stephen, I think, is back in the preaching rotation next week, and he's going to preach, I think, on Luke chapter 24 and the resurrection on Easter Sunday, right? It's pretty cool how God's worked it out with us taking a couple weeks off for us to end up where we are. Now, today, traditionally, we celebrate a Sunday. Does anybody know what today is? What traditional celebration today is? Palm Sunday. Why is it Palm Sunday? Why do we call it Palm Sunday? Anybody know why it's called Palm Sunday? Because when Jesus came in to Jerusalem, they put down the palm branches to welcome him. Why were they welcoming him? What were they celebrating him as? As king. I said this at the house today, and my wife did not think it was very funny. What happens on Friday? Jesus dies on Friday. And I said, a lot can happen in 5 days. She didn't think that was very funny. The curious thing about reading the Bible to me is we read events and we don't really always have a lot of context for how they go. Eddie preached on Luke 19, the story of Zacchaeus, several weeks ago, and in that chapter 19 was the Palm Sunday, and Eddie used the reference, which I thought was excellent. It was like the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade, where people are parading down the street, and there's lots of people cheering and watching. Well, we're in Luke chapter 23 today, which most people, not everybody, but most people believe Jesus died on Friday. Some people believe it was Wednesday. We won't argue that. But if Luke chapter 19 occurred on Palm Sunday on the first day of the week, and then Luke chapter 23 occurs on Friday, there's 4 chapters of Scripture that occur in a 5-day period. So you think about the book of Luke, Jesus' life was how long? 33 years, most people would assume, right? That's what historians tell us. So Luke chapter 2 is before Jesus is born. Luke chapter 2, Jesus is born. 33 years later, Luke chapter 23. But 4 of those 23, what's the fraction 4 of 23? Anybody know? Close? It's an eighth, right? Roughly an eighth. 424 says an eighth. 423 is close to an eighth. An eighth of Jesus' 33 years of life covers the last week of his life. That's pretty incredible, isn't it? That of all of the miracles we talk about Jesus, he fed 5,000, he walked on water, he healed people. But a lot of content is in the last 5 days. And we're going to focus on that. I'm going to try to keep our focus today in sections around things that Jesus said. A lot of times in our life, we remember the last things that people say to us. And the last words of people are meaningful. Now, these are not the last words of Jesus. And the words recorded in Luke are not all of the last words Jesus spoke while he was alive before his death. But there are some here, and they are impactful, and I think there's a theme in all of them. And at the end, I'll try to tie together what I think the theme of all that is. So if you're with me, we're going to start in verse 1 of chapter 23, and I'm going to read sections, and then we'll make a comment on a few of them. So Luke chapter 23, verse 1. If you were here for Phil, the end of chapter 22, just to catch us up contextually, the end of chapter 22, Jesus goes to the garden to pray. Judas comes in and betrays him. Jesus gets arrested. Peter denies Jesus. Jesus goes before the Sanhedrin, or the Jewish leaders, to be tried for the crimes that they are accusing him of. They realize they have no authority to do anything with Jesus. So chapter 23 begins in the middle of that story when Jesus gets to this guy named Pilate, who was the Roman governor in Jerusalem. So let's start in chapter 23, verse 1. Then their whole assembly rose up, brought him before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation, opposing payment of taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." So Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "You say so." Pilate then told the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no grounds for charging this man." But they kept insisting. He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all of Judea, from Galilee where he started, even to here. So they make all these accusations against Jesus. Pilate, who's the Roman governor, says, "Is this true?" And what's Jesus' answer?
You said so.
You said so. Does he defend himself?
No.
Does he make an argument that what they said was wrong? What does he say? That's what you say. Jesus does not offer a significant defense. Let's keep reading. Verse 6. When Pilate heard this, he asked if the man was a Galilean. Finding that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, so let me pause. Pilate was the governor of Jerusalem where this is taking place. Herod was the governor of Galilee where Jesus is from. So it would be like, if you're familiar with crimes in this country, it would be like extradition. You get caught in Ohio for a crime in West Virginia. The Ohio judge finds out, oh, wait a minute, I don't have jurisdiction to do this. You go back to where the crime is. And so because they're accusing him of things in Galilee, Pilate doesn't want anything to do with it, sends him back to Herod. So let's keep reading. Verse 8, Herod was very glad to see Jesus. For a long time he had wanted to see him because he had heard about him and was hoping to see some miracles performed by him. So he kept asking him questions, but Jesus did not answer him. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt, mocked him, dressed him in bright clothes, and sent him back to Pilate. That very day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Previously, they had been enemies. So we see Jesus go back to Herod. Herod's accusing him. What is Jesus' response to Herod? What did Jesus say? Verse 9. So he kept asking him questions, but Jesus did not answer. One of the most comical things I've ever heard in my life is when I hear people say that they have to defend what people are saying about God. Do you really think that God needs you to defend him? Sometimes we don't need to defend ourselves. And that's tough, isn't it? Because if you're saying something about me that I know not to be true, I want to fix it. I want to correct what you're saying. But you know what I can't do? I can't always control narratives. And sometimes I have to be okay with that. And that's tough. That's real tough. But Jesus set an example for us that he was on a path agreed upon between him and his Father, and nothing was going to deter that. Now, there are other curious things that happen in this section that I want to point out. If you look at verse 8, Herod was very glad to see Jesus. For a long time he had wanted to see him because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some miracle performed by him. What was Herod's view of Jesus? Jesus was an attraction. Jesus was a curiosity. Jesus was an event. Sadly, Jesus is that for a lot of people today, isn't he? Hey, Jesus, I'm in real trouble. Would you fix this for me? Hey, Jesus, I need $1 million. I'd really like for that to be direct deposited in my account first thing tomorrow morning. Hey, Jesus, my wife's been really mean to me. Would you make her stop? That's not true. But we see Jesus as this miracle worker that's just going to give me what I want. And that's not who Jesus is it? Jesus gives us everything we need and gives us his presence and his peace and eternal life. But he doesn't necessarily fix all of our problems, does he? But Herod saw Jesus as an attraction or an entertainment. The other thing that is really funny here, funny is an odd word, verse 12, that very day Herod and Pilate became friends. Previously they had been enemies. I have heard this said on a radio show that I used to listen to, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so Herod and Pilate agreed that they both didn't like Jesus. Isn't that odd? That they could agree on not liking Jesus? I just think that's a very odd thing to happen here. Now, I do want to point out one thing about verse 8 that I missed a minute ago. There is a prophecy in Isaiah about Jesus coming to be the sacrificial lamb and pay for our sins. Isaiah chapter 53. If you have not read that whole chapter, I'd encourage you to go back this week and read Isaiah chapter 53. Isaiah 53 verse 7 says this: he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to a slaughter, and like a sheep silent before his shearers, he did not open his mouth. So we read these scriptures. Why would Luke put this particular point in that Jesus didn't answer him? There's a direct correspondence to the prophecy of what Jesus would do. And so we see that. All right, let's keep reading, or I'm going to be here all day. Verse 13, Pilate called together the chief priests and the leaders of the people, and he said to them, "You have brought me this man as one who misleads the people. But in fact, after examining him in your presence, I have found no grounds to charge this man with those things you accused him of. Neither has Herod, because he sent him back to us. Clearly, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will have him whipped and release him." Then they all cried out together, "Take this man away, release Barabbas to us." He had been thrown into prison for rebellion that had taken place in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate addressed them again. But they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What has this man done wrong? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him whipped and then release him." But they kept up the pressure, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. So their voices won out. So Pilate decided to grant their demand and release the one they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for rebellion and murder, but he handed Jesus over to their will. A lot happens in here, and I'm going to refer to a little bit of it later. But what a great example of how politics works. Here's a politician sitting in front of people saying, this guy's done nothing wrong. He deserves to go free. But the will of the people is to crucify the one who's done nothing wrong and let the murderer and insurrectionist go free. And what does the leadership do? Do they do what's right, or do they do what's expedient? They did what was expedient, right? Pilate did what the people wanted him to do. Numbers are a big thing in the Bible. How many times did Pilate try to let Jesus go? 3 times. And on the 3rd time, he gave up and released Jesus to what they wanted to do. And there's a lot more content in other Gospels about Pilate's interaction and things that he said to Jesus. But it's very curious here that he relented to the will of the people and let him. Let me flip my page here, and we'll keep reading verse 26. As they led him away, they seized Simon a Cyrenian, who was coming in from the country, and laid the cross on him to carry behind Jesus. A large crowd of people followed him, including women who were mourning and lamenting. But turning to them, Jesus said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Look, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the women without children, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they did these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Now, a lot's happening here. Jesus is leaving Pilate. They've convinced him to be crucified. It's tradition that the person who's getting crucified has to carry their cross down the street to the place where they're going to be crucified. Jesus has been whipped, beaten, probably has been kept awake for hours on end. He physically is unable to carry the cross. A lot of people will say, well, Jesus was weak and meek, and so he wasn't strong enough. I don't imagine that's the case. I imagine his body physically was under so much duress that he was just melting under the weight of what was happening. Besides the fact Jesus mentally knew what was about to happen. And so we see this guy come to carry the cross for Jesus. What an image that you're recorded forever in scriptures as the person who carried the cross for Jesus. Now, the second thing that's interesting that's happening here is we hear Jesus have words again to people who were lining the streets. So if you come back to the image that Eddie gave us of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade and everybody cheering and excited for the parade and what a happy time it is, this is the exact opposite of that, right? You have a man trudging to his death, and some people are cheering for him to go be put to death, but the people he references are not those people, are they? He says, turning to the people who were mourning and lamenting him, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me." There is a section here where Jesus kind of reverts back to teaching in parables, and we spent a lot of time in the Lucan parables and all the parables Jesus taught where he's teaching things that don't necessarily make a lot of sense. And so there are 2 different pieces of that here that I want to touch on. The first one is, "Do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Look, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are women without children, and wombs that never bore, and breasts that never nursed.' They will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.'" Most people believe that this is Jesus foreseeing the future of what's going to happen when the Romans overthrow Jerusalem and burn it to the ground. In AD 70, right, I think is when Jerusalem falls and is completely destroyed. And so Jesus is prophetically speaking that. These people have no context for that. It would be like me telling you who's going to be president in 2070. I don't know who that is. Probably don't care, right? The second part is when Jesus refers to wood is green, and if they're doing that to green wood, what happens when the wood is dry? And I think from my research that it's fair to say that Jesus here is referring to himself. When he says the wood is green, how do you burn green wood? It's tough, right? Green wood has lots of sap and lots of moisture, and you got to have a pretty hot fire to get that to burn, and then you get lots of smoke. The wood is green here, I think, is Jesus referring to if they're doing this to someone who has no sin. Green is not sin covered. The dry wood would be full of sin. So the comparison Jesus is making, I think, is between what they're doing to him and what others would deserve. Right? Jesus was a sinless sacrifice. We would not be sinless sacrifices. But the most important thing I want to make in this section is when Jesus says, "Don't weep for me." Beginning Palm Sunday through Easter Sunday, what is the name that we commonly refer to for this week? What's it called traditionally? Holy Week. And what do we traditionally refer to Friday as? Why would we call it Good Friday? Is it a Good Friday? Who's it good for? It's good for us. Wasn't so good for Jesus, was it? But I think Jesus' words here are helpful for us. Don't weep for me. If you've had the opportunity to attend funerals for people that are really close to you, the emotion of saying goodbye is tough, right? If the person you're saying goodbye to in this earthly home is in the presence of God, why would you cry? You wouldn't cry for them because where they are is significantly better than where they were, true? But you cry for yourself because you have to say goodbye and part with that person for a period of time. But I think the takeaway here is Jesus does not want us to weep for what he's suffering, because what he's suffering is for our benefit and for our good. He wants us to remember it, but not with a sadness, but with a gladness. Okay, let's keep moving. Verse 32. Two other criminals were also led away to be executed with him. When they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on the right, one on the left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them because they do not know what they are doing." And they divided his clothes and cast lots. The people stood watching, even the leaders were scoffing. He saved others, let him save himself. If this is God's Messiah, the chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him. They came offering him sour wine and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." An inscription was written above him, "This is the King of the Jews." So what does Jesus say here? Is he speaking to the people there? No. He's having a private, prayerful moment with his Father. I read a quote from Spurgeon, who was a preacher and Bible scholar, and he said this, that this is probably not the first time Jesus has prayed this prayer, just the first time he had to do it without being able to be in private with his Father. And I think the takeaway here is if we go back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, in the Beatitudes, Jesus said this, "I tell you, Love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. And pray for those who mistreat you. Jesus set an example of praying for those who were mistreating him. Verse 39, then one of the criminals hanging there began to yell insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other, rebuking him, don't you even fear God, since you are undergoing the same punishment? We are punished justly because we're getting back what we deserve for the things we did. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. So Luke records this conversation between the two criminals who were crucified on either side of Jesus. One's mocking Jesus. The other one says, what are you doing, man? We're guilty. We deserve this. And in an interesting recognition, he says, this man did nothing wrong. How does this criminal know that Jesus did nothing wrong? I'll tell you why. Because Jesus understood that this man recognized Jesus as God. And Jesus says, I tell you today, truly you will be with me in paradise. Two things about that statement. One, Jesus was facing death, separation from God, but he knew exactly where he was going. Jesus had confidence in what the future held. And the second thing is, Jesus had the power to tell the man who understood him as God that he would take him with him. Jesus can be trusted. All right, let's keep going to try to get to the end of the chapter. Verse 44. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3, because the sun's light had failed. I thought about having all the lights turned off, the window covered, so the only thing you could see were these lights to simulate the darkness in the middle of the day, but I decided against it. But have you ever been in an eclipse when it gets dark in the middle of the day? And it's like, it's not really dark, but it's not really light, and there's this eerie kind of feeling. That's what's happening. The curtain of the sanctuary was split down the middle, and Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit. Saying this, he breathed his last. So who killed Jesus? Jesus killed Jesus. Pilate didn't kill Jesus. The Sanhedrin didn't kill Jesus. The angry mob didn't kill Jesus. We didn't kill Jesus. Jesus, when his time was come, committed his life to his Father on our behalf. And let's finish the chapter. Verse 47. When the centurion saw what happened, he began to glorify God, saying, this man really was righteous. All the crowds that had gathered for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, went home, striking their chest. But all who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. There was a good and righteous man named Joseph, a member of the Sanhedrin, who would not agree to their plan and action. He was from Arimathea, a Judean town, and looking forward to the kingdom of God. He approached Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Taking it down, he wrapped it in fine linen and placed it in a tomb cut into the rock, where no one had ever been placed. It was the preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. The woman who had come with him from Galilee followed along and observed the tomb and how his body was placed. Then they returned and prepared spices and perfume, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. So we see Jesus' burial, and we meet a guy named Joseph, who was a member of the religious leaders, who was not agreeable to putting Jesus to death, but believed in the coming of Jesus. And he took Jesus' body and put Jesus' body in a borrowed tomb, and that's where Jesus will be for our talk today, and Stephen will pick up with the body not being there next week in the resurrection. Now I want to do one more thing. I'm going to move that over here and try to make this quick. I moved that here and haven't said anything about it, so it will be obviously conspicuous. Jesus, before time began in Genesis, knew that this day would come. And his motivation was for our redemption, I believe. Jesus was born in a manger. We read about that in Luke 2. We read about Jesus going to the temple. And what did Jesus say to his parents when he was 12 years old? And his parents said, "Why are you in the temple?" What did he say? "I must be about my Father's business." We see Jesus all through this chapter with all kinds of opportunities to say, "No, I didn't do that. Get me out of here." What was his motivation? I don't know if I can do this, but I'm going to try. I don't have many gifts in life, but one of them is a loud and booming voice. I don't need that thing. And sometimes that comes in real handy. When you're coaching basketball and you want somebody to have your attention, you can yell and people are like, "Oh man, what's wrong with him?" And so because I have a loud booming voice, it has been my opportunity to do a lot of narrative readings. And probably 30 years ago, I did a narrative first-person reading about a character in the Bible named Barabbas. And there's a line in that reading that every Good Friday just crushes me. And the line was Barabbas saying that Jesus died on his cross. Now, can you imagine Barabbas standing in the crowd, looking at Jesus, who he knew had done nothing wrong, hanging on the cross that he should have hung on, thinking about the person he'd murdered? Barabbas was a murderer. He had killed somebody. And he stood there and watched Jesus hang on the cross, bent for him. Can you imagine? Barabbas was a guy who literally watched Jesus take the punishment for him. And now let's put it into today's terminology. What's your motivation? Jesus' motivation to go to the cross was for our redemption. The Father had a plan, and the Father and Jesus together put the plan in place. Jesus would come to the earth, take the form of a servant, be fashioned as a man, and then would humble himself to the cross. And so when you get up tomorrow morning, or when I get up tomorrow morning, or when Friday comes this week, is Friday just another day? Is Friday just another day? I'm going to have the joy of a lifetime this Friday. You know what I'm going to get to do this Friday? I'm going to get to see all 4 of my grandkids. And you know what their Lala's going to do? She's going to plan an Easter egg hunt because she likes to plan events. It's going to be fun. I'm going to love spending time with my grandkids. But the motivation for my life is not spending time with my grandkids. And the motivation for my life is not to make money to buy things. And the motivation for my life is not to have a good time or watch my team win championships or get the club face square on the back of a golf ball and watch that thing fly. As much as I love all of those things, the motivation of my life is to love God and love people. And if that's not the motivation of your life today, I really hope that you'll ask Jesus to help you with your motivation. So, I'm going to be done. Thank you for enduring my blubbering about Barabbas. But he experienced something that I hope everyone can experience. And that's the real and personal love of Jesus. All right, Stephen, if you'll put the questions up. We've got some questions, and we'll take 5 to 7 minutes and discuss those. Which last words of Jesus are most impactful to you? How does putting yourself in Barabbas' position change your perspective? What can you do this week to stay motivated by Jesus' sacrifice for you? Thank you.